13 Reasons Why is not good at discussing suicide. And before all you Hannah Baker stans burn the comments section, here's a spoiler alert. I don't think the show is bad. It's a teen drama. It has some good cinematography and acting, but it is not able to properly address or discuss suicide outside the effectiveness of an after-school special, or like Dawson's Creek. But also, I don't think that failure is on the part of Netflix, the writers, the stories, the directors, or the book it's based on. Not really. Buckle up, children. 13 Reasons Why started as a young adult novel by Jay Asher, ultimately becoming a #1 New York Times bestseller in 2011. The book garnered a lot of praise for expressly talking about a variety of issues: rape, assault, bullying, slut-shaming, and of course, suicide. And that was a much bigger deal in 2007 than it was in 2017 when the show was released. We are now in a post-Brock Turner, post-Glee, post-revenge porn site world. Society's response to those issues has improved from 2007, even if it is in the slightest way. And I think this works to the detriment of the show. Slut-shaming is still a massive issue nowadays. Pretending like it's not would not only be wrong, but a disservice to many. However, I think it would also be incorrect to say that 16-year-olds in 2007 would react the same way as 16-year-olds in 2017 when it comes to sharing illicit photos or spreading rumors about a girl being lesbian. Does that automatically invalidate the show? Of course not, because I'm sure there are still communities and situations where the response to Hannah Baker would be similar to the show. But I do think it speaks to a lack of adaptation, an adaptation that would align the show's actions for the 2017 teenager. Because a huge part of the show, even touted by the creative team behind the series, is this idea of realism. And this is a talking point both to the merit and detraction of the show. Either the realism shows how things really are, it doesn't sugarcoat it, or the realism is inherently harmful, that we can discuss these issues without being so insensitive and showing such inflammatory imagery. But I fall into a third camp. I say, 13 Reasons Why isn't realism at all. The common trend of modern cinema has been to achieve an aesthetic and narrative that mimics reality, to wholly copy so that the resulting immersion can close the gap on an audience suspension of disbelief. But reality can never be an element of film. To understand this idea better, let's use the frame of a genre that attempts to combine reality and cinema: documentary. And this idea was like the first thing I was taught in film school. Documentary attempts to be an unbiased telling of the truth. The world the film presents is taken as an acceptable fact that we as the audience buy into when we start watching. This takes place in the real world. This is what is happening. This is how this topic exists or did exist in the same world that I live in. And while yes, we the audience are expected to have a certain level of doubt for but we also expect this film to have a basis in a true reality. But that's not an achievable premise. Film has a particular language, one that requires reality to be edited and moved and positioned in a way that the audience will recognize. Documentaries are not in real time. They are not without scripting. They are not without editing. And most importantly, they are not without impression from a creator's perspective. Because the reality of documentary, as with all films, is that bias cannot be detached. There will be a manipulation in what you are seeing, even if it is benign. As Wolf Koenig said, every cut is a lie. It's never that way. Those two shots were never next to each other in time that way. But you're telling a lie in order to tell the truth. Take Super Size Me, a film I saw 3 times during my public school years because apparently teaching about healthy eating directly isn't as fun. Morgan Spurlock speaks the legitimizing language of documentary. At the beginning of the film, he sets out a list of rules for himself to follow during his 30-day docu-experiment of fast food. These were: eat nothing but McDonald's, eat 3 square meals a day, eat every item on the menu, and finish each of those items. How wonderfully transparent this film is! Upfront truth must mean scientific integrity of how McDonald's affects the average American, except that Spurlock ate an average of 5,000 calories a day when the recommended intake for his size is 2,500. And he forced himself to finish food even when he was already full. This latter idea led to an infamous scene where his Big Mac becomes a big smack of vomit on the parking lot ground. And this is great drama. This is filmic language. It's a correlation of events that led to an unpleasant conclusion. But vomit will always be gross to see on film. It will always elicit a negative reaction, whether the contents used to be a burger or broccoli. And yes, the documentary followed a transparent list of rules. But that doesn't mean the film isn't manipulative or lacking an agenda. Because choosing to show the vomit, or choosing where to point the camera, or who to show on camera, that is a choice. And one that is required to be made in order to be functional as a film. Before any of you start typing your angry comments, I know that 13 Reasons Why is not a documentary, that it's not a true story, and it's not intending to be. But for a narrative show, the filmmakers sure do try and mimic the aesthetics of documentary. Mostly, I think this is done to create a certain amount of legitimacy and respect for the topics they are covering, which isn't a bad thing. It's something designed with very good intentions. However, by placing the show's visual style so similar to documentary, the connotation of real is also projected onto the narrative. And the narrative greatly manipulates realism for the sake of dramatic function to reach the widest audience possible. I think we can all agree the show is not perfect, and certain choices were obviously made with the intention of streamlining and dramatizing the plot, more than they were for the positive or safe representation of the key issue. While attempting to show sensitive topics with respect, the narrative ultimately places Hannah's trauma into an arena of grandeur. The actions taken against her progress in harsher and harsher traumas. Her story is plagued by beats of escalation, and once Hannah's final action is taken, the show resets itself, with the fallout repeating the escalation again. Her suicide pits enemies in a battle to the finish, where her axe stands over them all, as the grandiose inciting incident. But suicide is not grandiose.
We turn now to a nationwide tragedy, suicide. A new report from the Centers for Disease Control says it is growing rapidly among teenagers.
In the United States, suicide remains a difficult topic to deal with because so often it is plagued by political, social, and religious connotations. It is bipartisanly accepted that suicide is terrible and needs to be solved. No one is advocating that suicide is not an issue. However, the response on how to best deal with it is where the arguing and party divide begins. That is where the trouble in finding a solution comes from. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for people between the ages of 15 and 24. And some of the largest risk factors include sexual orientation, autism, race, and those with a history of assault, trauma, or chronic pain. And I give the show credit for touching on some of these issues. Sexual assault, bullying, isolation, social rejection, death of classmates, and general trauma are all extremely relevant. And by talking openly about these issues, even in problematic ways, I think the show has reduced some of the stigma surrounding suicide. By allowing teenagers a reference point for trauma, suicidal thoughts, and assault through a protagonist, a sympathetic portrayal is created. However, I cannot give the show a pass on certain aspects that are damaging. The lack of focus on mental illness kinda undercuts the idea the show is trying to break a stigma. The show presents Hannah's decision as a chain of cause and effect. Bad things happen, she feels bad, another bad thing, she feels worse, repeated in a cycle until she takes her own life. It follows a logic, but in a way that skirts the stigma of mental illness. I'd argue there's something far more acceptable in the idea that, oh, bad things happen to her, so there's a reason why she feels this way. Makes sense. Mental illness is not as easy to explain, and it remains misunderstood by a large percentage of the general population. And suicidal thoughts are not logical things. Say the show had the trauma stop at the spreading of her and Courtney's photo. Yes, we still get the resulting social ostracism, and these acts in turn cause Hannah to sink into a depression. Would the story play out the same? Would Hannah's decision be viewed the same? Or would a number of people no longer be compelled because suddenly it's not the same level of tragedy? It's no longer holding a narrative overload that controversial media requires. And I want to be very clear here in the fact that there is no point in measuring traumas or pains. If the story had stopped at just the photo being shared, Hannah's pain would be just as legitimate. But because suicide is wrapped in these political and social connotations, to avoid trenching into a gray area of sympathy, the story gives the character a massive list of traumas, each getting progressively darker. Because if a story about controversial topics wants to appeal to the largest audience possible without alienating members based on ideas of morality or drive, the distinction between sympathetic or not is forced into a very stark black and white background. And the biggest issue that myself and others have with this show is the visual representation of Hannah committing suicide. It should not have been shown. In no way should this have been depicted. The defense of the suicide scene from the show's fans really irks me, because many claim that this scene gives a legitimacy to the filmic representation of suicide, one that Hollywood doesn't typically show. Defenders claim that most suicide scenes are played beautifully, with sad music over a crying person, and the dramatic power is realized in a way that retains a certain level of aesthetic comfort, that it remains visually shallow. But not in 13 Reasons Why! The camera doesn't cut away, there's no non-diegetic sound, the acting is strong and brutal, with the ultimate result being a painful, harsh, and unyielding recreation. and currently these visual cues are connoted with realism. I'd argue that the widespread use of these aesthetics can probably be traced to the popularity of found footage horror films like Blair Witch Project. Grayscaling color palettes and the use of shaky cam were taken specifically from the aesthetic of documentary, but utilized in a fictitious film to be presented as real. Later on, The Dark Knight and Bourne Identity used these aesthetics to add an element of grit and darkness, attempting to overshadow or ground the fantastical ideas and silly concepts. And 10 years on, the style is becoming almost industry standard, the result being that we as a media-consuming culture have adjusted our connotation of what on film translates as real. Smooth lines and bright lit spaces with a range of colors no longer visually translates as real. The artifice of film is too obvious when presented beautifully. And this scene utilizes almost all of these techniques. It is undoubtedly dark. But realism is not solely created in the aesthetic, but also in the narrative. Suicide for Hannah is the action which simultaneously completes the plot and reignites it. Leaving the scene till the final episode is purposefully done to collect all the trauma and pain we as an audience have witnessed this character go through. Through flashback, we see everything that Hannah has. We witness her pain firsthand in a way that many never will be able to. And unfortunately, in a way many will. But that's what bothers me about this scene. Its placement. We wait 12 episodes, we know it happened, we know it's going to happen, and the unfortunate result is a scene that seems inevitable. A scene that, as disgusting as it is to admit, seems almost rewarded to the audience. It is powerful because of the imagery, yes, but it is also powerful because it has been anticipated. Even if it was created with good intentions, even if the creators wanted to showcase a suicide scene without the tropes commonly attached with Hollywood films, the result is a plot sequenced in a way that pivots its emotional high point to be a scene that was advised against. It's not incidental, it's not mandatory, it is self-serving.
Yes.
And perhaps that's the harshest thing about having a narrative story about suicide. The character never stands a chance. No one will ever catch the warning signs, no one will ever intervene, and no alternative option is given. But if it was, would it actually change the impact? Imagine we're back in episode 13. Everything in the plot has played exactly the same. Character actions, story keynotes, nothing shifted from the series yet. And we get to that infamous scene, and Hannah sits down in the water, and just as she begins, her mother comes in. Comes home early, catches her before the damage is irreversible, and Hannah is taken to the hospital. She's given treatment, and when the psychiatrist finally comes to evaluate her, she tells her whole story. Not disseminated through the public school system through dated technology, not pressuring teenagers to solve the criminality of others, but direct to a protective authority. And the rest of the episode drops all the unfinished plot lines from previous episodes because they never happened. Instead, we get a clear guide on how the real-life procedures of care works. Reporting sexual assault, therapy to overcome issues, advice given to Hannah's parents on how to treat her moving forward. And at the end of the episode, after months or years of recovery, Hannah comes back into contact with her tapes. Recorded, ready, waiting to tell a truth that already came out through due process, therapy, and police intervention. And Hannah sits there holding her tapes, grateful someone stopped her, grateful she was not successful, and we, the audience, having watched 12 full episodes where we know what the alternative would be, are grateful as well. You haven't changed the show at all. You still get 12 episodes of the same story. You still see the impact of bullying and the fallout of traumatic actions. And this isn't too far off from Jay Asher's original ending. Hannah was meant to survive, but he didn't choose it because he believed Hannah surviving would detract from the seriousness. But is that ending any more or less serious or realistic or impactful? We still see the emotional pain. We still see the impact others can have on one another. But this time, with this ending, we see how the real-world process of recovery is. We see how a life can move past such things, and how audience members may use those tools and knowledge to go about reporting and asking for help in a similar manner. This isn't dark lighting and shaky cam realness. This is showing young viewers what fixing and reporting and dealing with this issue is actually like in the real world. It gives a framework for them to base off of. It gives an expectation for how society should handle these situations. And it does all of that while maintaining the dramatic and narrative functions that TV shows require. And for anyone who claims that my suggested ending is a cop-out or isn't realistic, well, whether 13 Reasons Why strives for reality or fakeness, the least it should be able to do is give a young woman faced with insurmountable trauma the option to live. Film is not reality. And that doesn't mean I think films should stop trying to close that gap. Every year, new techniques and tactics come out to do just that, and the results can be wonderful. However, 13 Reasons Why cannot be the key discussion piece for suicide. It can't be for bullying. It can be an entertaining show, it can be a dramatic and groundbreaking piece in the Netflix pie. It can even be art. But 13 Reasons Why is not a therapist. It is not a how-to guide. It should not be touted as a serious discussion point for assault and suicide any more than Secret Life of the American Teenager or Dawson's Creek. It's just a show. And if we really want to change the way the United States deals with teen suicide, we have to get political, we have to get controversial, and we have to recognize the inherent failings within our society that lead to such events being allowed to happen so frequently. We can't just expect a show to fix that, regardless of how realistic it is.
Friends screaming, let me out. Tomorrow, let me have